Good morning, everyone. I'd like to speak about something today that's close to all of us, and I hope you guys kind of can stay with me on this because I'm going a little non-traditional. Those of us that speak typically have a specific style of speaking, and we speak based on inspiration of what we understand based on our knowledge and our own experiences as to who God is and what God is. Now, try to listen to my choice of words, and I'll give you another hint of what I just said, who and what God is. Because if you doze off, you might think I'm saying one thing when I mean something else. Just so, we are on the same page, right? So I think speaking should be, this is my opinion, intuitive and edifying at the same time. When someone speaks, you understand it, and it can reach out and touch your soul, if you will, if you're understanding what is meant, right? Because when we share, and this is the thing, everyone gets to express themselves and their own knowledge and experience of who and what, once again, God is. And as a speaker, we traditionally stand at the pulpit and talk to you or at you about those things pertaining to God, and we add our own experience. But to me, that's not what sharing really is. I share my understanding with you, but what are you sharing with me from within yourself if you're not able to respond back? If I said something you didn't agree with or you misunderstood, how would I know? Would you talk among yourselves and not tell me what you think because you might think it offends me or all of those kind of things in traditional speaking is what we do. Okay? Where do some of these things that we do as part of our process come from? I'm going to share a story about how a simple incident with a company resulted in turmoil and resentment from the employees because of what we consider, based on society norms, as ambitious or overzealous. Those are words that you hear. Ambitious. That means, wow, they're a go-getter. And overzealous means, if you ask me to do something, I go way above and beyond with great pleasure, right? So here's a story. I started working for IBM probably about 10 years ago, which is not important. But in orientation, we went through about 3 days up in Armonk, New York. There's a little town north of the city. And, they get you in there and they give you this binder with everything that you need to know to become an IBM employee, from human resources to, different websites that you can go log into and get help as needed, right? So what I remember plainly were some of the conversations, and I enjoyed it because it really made me see not only as a company that large, they make mistakes that could be costly, but also that they are more, are trying to be more, human conscious, if you will. So one of the stories, and this is one of the stories they told us was, and this is more of a sales story. They had this order over in Europe, and they were signing a contract with UPS And in that contract, you know, they have all of these statements of work, of the work to be done for the company, for UPS, and knowing that, you know, things are negotiated, they talk to lawyers, and things are signed, and then if it's not in agreement, they will send it back to you, and you'll read it over and make a decision as to whether you want to go that route or not, and sign it. And now the deadline of the work to be done was approaching. So UPS told IBM to send them the contract overnight so that they can make a decision within the next couple of days. So IBM did. They did exactly what UPS asked them, and they FedExed it to UPS. Well, needless to say, IBM lost that contract. And that was one of the lessons learned. When you're dealing with a company, you know, you have to be very cognizant of what's going on and how things are done. Protocol, right? So why would I FedEx UPS something that I wanted to do for them? FedEx just happened to be IBM's carrier of choice at that time, but that wasn't, you know, I would have UPS'd it if I were them. And that was a lessons learned, right? But one of the biggest lessons that we learned, and this is how they dealt with the client. But now let's look at how they did things internally. So when the owner of IBM established the company way back early, you know, they were more of a business machine, like typewriters, and they did all of these things. And IBM was huge. It started out as a typical company, and it grew. And it just kept growing, and now it's probably 400,000 strong. But during the early days, not to get off too far off track, during the early days of their existence, the owner, the founder of IBM being Big Blue, would always wear blue suits and patent leather shoes. And, you know, that was what he did. That was his signature. But as the company grew and he hired his leadership team, they learned that the leaders up under him decided to impose upon their employees that if you're going to work for IBM, you're going to wear blue suit and patent leather shoes. Now, this was, to me, and for all of us out there, we call that minions or clonies, but, you know, that's how that thing progressed. The leadership underneath the owner, without the owner imposing this, decided to impose this upon the employees. Now, as a regular employee, you couldn't really afford to have multiple blue suits and patent leather shoes at the time. So it caused a little bit of contention in the company. It caused a little bit of animosity and resentment because, you know, you started to hear stories based on the orientation facilitator that when people quit, they would mail in their shoes and blue suit because they didn't feel that it was fair for them to have to do that. And I guess during those times, once it was figured out that it wasn't the owner that did this, it was the owner's leadership employees, that they changed that policy. So, you know, it became a more people-oriented company, and it's grown from there. You know, traditional hierarchical leadership is no longer a part of the company. We do things called matrix leadership, where the leaders and the managers of the company is there to kind of help the people that's doing the job get the job done better. So these are change. This is an evolution. Now, to say all of that, we live in a world where human nature tends to take over. It tends to take in examples of Christianity and understanding God. Human nature tends to take God's process out of context also. Just like those employers imposed that that their employees wear blue suits and patent leather shoes, we as a people with human nature tends to take that same stance when we go out to talk about God and His process. You know, once again, having a little bit of fun or changing a little bit, sometimes we use characters to explain some things. And I'm going to provide a name for what I'd like to talk about, and I'll add a little humor to it. I'm going to call this character Uncle Ruckus. And what I'm going to talk about is going to be the Uncle Ruckus effect. So everyone knows an Uncle Ruckus in their family. So who's Uncle Ruckus? Let's see. You know, as we read books throughout the Bible, the lessons that we learn should be based on trusting in God and growing in His grace, right? We all know that. And let me start from the beginning. I'm going to start my venture in explaining the Uncle Ruckus effect in some cases. And I'm going to start in Exodus. And I'm going to start in chapter 14. And I'm going to read verses 10 through 12. Exodus 14, verses 10 through 12. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching at them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Okay. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. But isn't that the same thing as it is better for us to stay in sin than to transform out? Right. So what we learn from this account in Exodus is that the Israelites thought they were doomed. After watching God's powerful hand deliver them from Egypt, their only response was fear, whining, and despair. So where was their trust in God, if you think about that? Just to be clear, that is what I call the Uncle Ruckus effect. Rather than understand that everything that God had done to free them from the bondage of Egypt, Uncle Ruckus sought to go back to what was comfortable as a slave to the Egyptians. So, today, the title of my message is going to be Thinking Outside the Box. So, and the reason I decided for that title of Thinking Outside the Box is when you're comfortable with something, whether it's good for you or not, you tend to want to stick with it. And Exodus is one of many encounters that suggest that human nature is subject to that box. You know, we read the stories throughout the Bible from the beginning to the end where people rather stay comfortable with what they have than to seek more from God's perspective. You know, we do seek more physically. We want to get out there and make all that money and do all of those things that gives us status. But I'll get to that part. I'll get to that. You know, I shared a story about IBM and how the leadership took it upon themselves to impose what they thought was the right thing to do to impress the founder of the company. And he never asked them to impose that hardship upon the employees. You would think that's a good gesture from the leadership to the owner, but in reality, it's just human nature trying to be relevant to the boss, if you will, at the expense of someone else. And in today's era, we call that kissing the ring. You know, I'm going to do everything that I think you want me to do that will please you so I can advance in life, so that I can advance in the company. You know, knowing God enables us to grow, to understand His process, you know, we should be able to take that as Christians and as God's people and apply this to everyday life. So God's process is about being part of something bigger than ourselves. But when we're in a box, we fail to understand what that means sometimes. This is why God blinds us to the truth when we start to go down that path, right? You know, we want to be ambitious and we want to do things that's impressive to those that we tend to look up to or admire. But that's not God's agenda. It may not even be theirs. It's our own way of thinking and being relevant. So once again, let's turn to 2 Corinthians. I'm going to read chapter 4. And this is why, you know, I mentioned that God blinds us to the truth sometimes. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I'm going to start in verse 3. And even if our gospel is vile, it is vile to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made His light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the faith of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that all surpassing power is from God and not from us. So what we must understand is the gospel is open and revealed to everyone, except to those who refuse to have faith in God, if you think about it. Satan is really the god of this age. He's the god of this earth, and his work is to deceive. And he has also blinded those who don't believe in Christ for his own purpose. You know, the attraction of money, power, and pleasure blinds people to the light of Christ's gospel. Just think about that. Those who reject Christ and prefer their own pursuit has unknowingly made Satan their god, the god of this earth, physical. Once again, to clarify myself, I didn't say just believe when I said believe in. It didn't say that in the Bible. It said believe in, right? And there's a difference. To believe something could be insinuating that, yeah, I believe that could be, but to believe in something is to have it within your heart. There's a difference. You know, do you know what the good and bad thing about being a free moral agent is? We talk about that sometimes, a free moral agent. You know, the thing is, when we were created, that gave us the ability to make choices, to choose. And we all know that we have choices and that we have, and what we were given as a part of our creation was that ability. We wasn't told that you must do it this way because this is how you were created. We were given an option. And given that, let's look at how things went. You know, there's examples of things that went kind of bad based on being given that option as a choice to make, right? So we know we can make choices that are selfish as well as unselfish. And we all know that Uncle Ruckus makes those selfish choices. But do we know why? He will give you up for his own gain. He will deceive you so that you can make the wrong choice yourself if you're not careful and understand what he's doing. So let's look at some examples in the Bible and let's compare it to how we live today. You know, in Matthew 26, and I'm going to read a couple of verses, Matthew 26, verse 13 through 15. It says, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So what does that mean? This is where I cut in here where Mary had actually given Jesus perfume during while he was with the disciples, right? And I'll get into more detail with that. So that's verse 13. Let's go to verse 14 to get down to the Uncle Ruckus part of this, right? Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. Do you ask yourself why Judas would want to betray Jesus? Could it have been that Judas, like the other disciples, expected that Jesus was going to start a rebellion and overthrow Rome? Let's look at it a little deeper and try to understand how human nature comes into this. And we're talking about people that was next to a breathing being, Jesus, that was alive and human. So let's consider something. As a treasurer, Judas assumed that he would be given an opportunity and an important position in Jesus' new government. But when Jesus praised Mary for pouring out the perfume worth a year's salary to her, Judas may have realized at that point that Jesus' kingdom was not physical or political, but spiritual. You know, Judas's greedy desire for money and status at that moment could no longer be realized if he followed Jesus, because he was physical. So he betrayed Jesus in exchange for money and favor from the religious leaders in that day. Now, where do I come up with this, right? If we go to Mark chapter 10, let's go to Mark chapter 10, and I'm going to read verses 35 through verse 37. It says, this is what led up to this, right? Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. Okay, so how does this relate to Judas's betrayal? In verse 37, in those in verse 37 specifically, the disciples, like most Jews of that day, had the wrong idea of the Messiah's kingdom as it was predicted by the prophets in the Old Testament, because they thought Jesus would establish an earthly kingdom that would free Israel from Rome's oppression. James and John wanted honor places in this kingdom, and this was a physical kingdom. But Jesus' kingdom was not of this world. It's not centered in palaces and thrones, but in the hearts and lives of his followers. The disciples didn't understand this until up to the point to where Jesus was resurrected. Now, let's explore our own existence and how we are part of this thing that's bigger than we are, and how we should be thinking outside the box. We all know that we have the ability to make choices. We talked about the free moral agency. That was created within us as part of our creation. So we can make choices, once again, that are selfish, as well as choices that are not selfish. If we are able to think outside the box, and this is the physical box, we should know that God's Holy Spirit will help guide us to make the right choices if we trust in Him and not our own selves. And when we start to do things on our own, we have to consider something. Satan's influence is all around us, and he plants seeds continuously. With that, mixed with human nature and the desire for physical gain in this world, we can become blinded to God's truth. Jesus mentioned it many times and in many different ways. We think about all of these things that Jesus say, the parables that we call them. The parables throughout the Bible was not to confuse us, though, but it was to get through to us because we all have different upbringings, different backgrounds, different cultures. So, we think that, the parables, and you hear a lot that he spoke in parables and nobody could understand him. But for the people that he was speaking to, they understand it. So, for example, if I'm a fisherman and I understand those things that are said that I can relate to, that he's saying, because it's about fish, if you will, I get it. And it's more to it than that also, though, but I get it. So when he say those things that I understand as a fisherman, I'm edified, right? But if I hear what's meant for the fisherman and I'm a carpenter, I might not understand that. However, if I hear something that I can relate to regarding carpentry, I get it. You see where I'm going with this? Then I am edified to the word because I get it. And when we see the word or hear the word or understand it, it helps us. Once again, when we see and read the word light throughout the Bible, we see brightness and enlightenment. And I mentioned this once before when I spoke. As you read your Bible and you come across certain words like light, which we see that as something physical because you can see it. Have you tried to look into the depth of what that light means? It's a physical word. It's something you can see. Try replacing that word sometimes with love and see how it fits. Now, I'm going to have to clarify that, because we also must be able to discern between the physical meaning of light and the spiritual meaning of light. You know, and let's try a few of these, but I want to go back to one thing that I had read earlier, just to kind of put things in perspective, and it was 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to read that one more time in chapter 4, and I'll go in verse 4 this time. I won't go to verse 3. It says, "The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." You know, a lot of times when I think about light in this perspective, you know, I go back to Genesis, and in Genesis it talks about physical light and the creation of everything, but in 126 it's talking about creating us in our image, right? And Christ, also being the image of God, has light of the gospel. And as I said just a minute ago, try replacing the word light with love. And let me read it again. Verse 4. "The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the love of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God," who created man in our own image, once again, based on what Genesis 1:26 says, right? So here's some more examples, right? So as I started, I started to go through some of the books and the verses. I picked out a few, and let's try a few more. Matthew 5, verses 13. "You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." And then verse 14 specifically says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." Okay, going back to the beginning, I'm going to replace the word light with love. Not trying to take this out of context, but understanding that certain words throughout the Bible meant certain things. Verse 14, "You're the love of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people physical light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives love to everyone in the house." Okay? One more example, or another example, Matthew 5, and I'm going to go down to verse 15 on this one. Talking about this lamp again. "Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." And 16, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Now I'm going to read 16 again, and I'm going to replace light with love. "In the same way, let your love shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Right? In verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So we can keep going. We can go on this forever if you think about it. But I'm just going to do a couple more and move on from there as I start to close. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 27 through 30. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. These verses are a good example of how when Jesus was talking to the religious leaders, they wanted to trap him with the question that would show him to be either a blasphemer or some fanatic. Instead, Jesus had countered their question with a question about John. And I'll, if you think about what questions they asked him in Matthew, it provoked him or enabled him to say what he said, starting in verse 27. But they tried to trap him. So and at that point, they wanted to save face because he countered them with what he said. And I'll go there and I'll go there back to what he was referring to. You know, John had irritated the religious leaders back then, and that's what was going on at this time with Jesus also. And they were irritated because of their own self-interest, because they were only concerned about position and reputation. You know, they weren't looking for the truth. Instead, they were in the dark, and they wanted to do their deeds of evil. So, what am I saying here? Why were they irritated with John, and why were they irritated with Jesus? Going back to Matthew chapter 3, and I'm going to read verse 7 through 10. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not think you can say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." So, you know, we read also many instances that references how selfishness, if you will, is a desirable trait that God approves of. If you're selfless, right? We read the Bible, and whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, the lessons are based on perseverance and trusting in God. You know, I could talk about, you know, how human nature with a seed planted by Satan can cause man to make choices that are not of God approval. But, you know, I talked about that briefly with the reference to Uncle Ruckus. And then, you know, I can talk about how greed and self-purpose and obsessive behavior can distract us from maintaining focus on godly behavior. You know, when we're in fear or not feeling who God is, we tend to go back to our own understanding and our own agenda. We tend to want to have purpose and make things our own, and therefore try to change God's agenda to be our own agenda. And that's where we get in our own way, and we don't have God process in mind. And we then start to create problems distractions that can cause division. You know, God's love is based on flexibility and serving, not being served or unflexible. So if you find yourself feeling as though you're on an island sometimes, consider whether you're able to give your problems to God instead of making it the way you think it should be. You know, fulfilling God's agenda should be at the forefront of our actions by being, you know, that transportation of delight that we know of as love. And although Uncle Ruckus might fight this because of his unbelief, and he tried to push his own agenda due to fear of not knowing God, we should show him the love and selflessness that God wants us to share with everyone alike. Have a wonderful Sabbath.